The boy couldn't have been more than 14. He stood in the doorway of the ranch house like something the wind had carried in and forgotten to take back, dust on his clothes, blood dried brown at his temple, and eyes that had seen too much for someone who should have still been climbing trees. Jacob Mercer didn't move from his chair on the porch. He'd been watching the horizon for the better part of an hour, coffee gone cold in his tin cup, when the boy appeared at the edge of his property line. No horse, no pack, just boots worn through at the toe and a limp that said he'd walked farther than most men would ride. "You lost?" Jacob asked, voice low and even. The boy shook his head. His hand gripped the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "No, sir." Jacob waited. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, a dry whisper that carried the scent of sage and distant rain that would never come. Somewhere behind the barn, his mare nickered, uneasy. "Then you're running," Jacob said. The boy's throat worked. He didn't answer, but his eyes flicked back over his shoulder, quick, instinctive, toward the empty road that stretched out into the flats. Jacob set the cup down slow, let his hand rest on his knee where the boy could see it. No gun, no threat, just patience. He'd learned a long time ago that silence pulled truth out faster than questions ever could. "My sister," the boy said finally, voice cracking. "She's hurt." Jacob's gaze shifted past him, scanning the yard, the tree line, the ridge beyond. "Where is she?" "In the gully, half-mile back." The boy swallowed hard. "I couldn't carry her no more." Jacob stood and the boy flinched. Not much, just a tightening in his shoulders, a half-step back, but enough to tell Jacob what kind of men he'd been around lately. "Easy," Jacob said. He moved past the boy without touching him, grabbed his coat from the hook inside the door. "Show me." The girl was small, maybe 10, and she didn't make a sound when Jacob lifted her. That bothered him more than the blood. She lay curled in the dry creek bed where the boy had left her, half hidden under scrub oak, her dress torn at the shoulder and her face pale as bone. A gash ran along her ribs, shallow but angry, and her breathing came in short, careful pulls like every breath cost something. "What happened?" Jacob asked, carrying her back toward the house. The boy walked beside him, stumbling over roots he couldn't see through the exhaustion. "Men came to our camp," the boy said, 3 nights ago, said we were on land that wasn't ours." His voice went flat. "They killed our pa, told us to run." Jacob didn't ask why they hadn't. He knew, you don't run from men like that. You survive them, if you're lucky, and you remember their faces until the day you die. "They're coming?" Jacob asked. The boy nodded. "Yes, sir." "How far behind?" "Don't know, maybe a day, maybe less." The boy's voice cracked again. "Sir, if they come." Jacob shouldered open the door to the house, carried the girl inside. He laid her on the cot by the hearth, gentle as he could manage, and she stirred just enough to open her eyes. They were dark, fever-bright, and they fixed on her brother with something close to panic. "It's all right," the boy whispered, kneeling beside her. "We're safe." Jacob didn't correct him. He fetched water from the basin, tore a clean strip of cloth from an old shirt, and set to cleaning the wound. The girl bit her lip but didn't cry out. "What's your name?" Jacob asked the boy. "Elijah, sir. This is my sister, Sarah." Jacob nodded once, wrung out the cloth. "You got family anywhere else?" Elijah shook his head. "No, sir, just us now." The fire crackled low in the hearth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Jacob worked in silence, stitching the gash with thread he kept for mending saddles, his hands steady despite the weight pressing down on the room. When he finished, he sat back, wiped his hands clean. Sarah's eyes had closed again, her breathing easier now, and Elijah slumped in the chair beside her like all the strength had finally run out of him. "Sir," Elijah said quietly, not looking up, "if they come, hide my sister." Jacob stood, walked to the window, looked out at the empty land stretching toward the mountains. The sky was turning the color of old brass, shadows lengthening across the valley. Somewhere out there, men were riding, men who thought mercy was weakness and land was something you took with blood. "They'll have to go through me first," Jacob said. Elijah lifted his head. stared at him like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. Jacob turned from the window, met the boy's eyes. "You hear me?" Elijah nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "Then get some rest, both of you." Jacob pulled his coat back on, checked the rifle hanging above the door. "I'll keep watch." He stepped out onto the porch as the last light bled out of the sky, and the wind carried the smell of dust and distance and something else. Thing that tasted like smoke and iron, and the kind of violence that didn't ask questions. Jacob sat down in his chair, rifle across his knees, and waited. The boy woke just before dawn, startled by the silence. Jacob hadn't moved from the porch. He sat in the same chair, rifle still resting across his lap, eyes fixed on the road like he'd been carved from stone. The sky had gone from black to gray, the stars fading into a thin wash of light that made the land look older than it was. Elijah stepped out, barefoot, shivering in the cold. "You been out here all night." "Seemed like the right thing to do," Jacob said without looking at him. Elijah wrapped his arms around himself, stared out at the empty road. "You don't know these men, sir. They ain't the kind that stop." "Most men aren't," Jacob said, "till they meet someone who makes them." Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you helping us?" Jacob finally turned, looked at the boy. His face was weathered, lined with years that hadn't been kind, but his eyes were steady. "You ever ask yourself why you didn't leave your sister behind?" Elijah blinked. "I couldn't." "That's why," Jacob said simply. The boy didn't know what to say to that. He stood there, small and uncertain, until Jacob nodded toward the door. "Go check on her. I'll make breakfast." Inside, Sarah was awake. She lay still on the cot, her face turned toward the window where the light was just starting to creep in. When Elijah knelt beside her, she reached for his hand. "Where are we?" she whispered. "Safe," Elijah said, "for now." Her eyes found Jacob, who was moving quietly around the small kitchen, splitting kindling, setting a pot on the stove, measuring out cornmeal and salt. She watched him like she was trying to figure out if he was real. "He's gonna help us," Elijah said softly. Sarah's grip tightened. "They're coming, Eli." "I know." "You can't fight them." Her voice was small, trembling. "You have to hide, you have to." "We're not hiding," Elijah said, though his voice shook too. "Not anymore." Jacob set 3 tin plates on the table, poured water into cups. He didn't say anything, just worked with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from years of living alone. When the cornbread was ready, he brought it to the table, set it down, and looked at the two of them. "Eat," he said. "You'll need your strength." Elijah helped Sarah to the table. She could barely sit upright, leaning heavy against her brother, but she took the plate Jacob offered and picked at the bread with shaking fingers. "You should leave," she said suddenly, looking at Jacob, "before they get here." Jacob met her eyes. "This is my land." "They'll kill you," Sarah said, her voice breaking, "just like they killed Pa." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Maybe, but they'll remember it." Elijah stared at him. "Sir." "I'm not sending you back out there," Jacob said, his tone brooking no argument, "and I'm not hiding in my own house while men like that ride through." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "We clear." Elijah nodded slowly. Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. She just sat there, small and fragile and afraid, and Jacob saw it all, the weight she carried, the fear she couldn't shake, the way she looked at her brother like he was the only thing left in the world that mattered. "How long have you been running?" Jacob asked quietly. 3 days, Elijah said. "We walked mostly at night, hid during the day." "They track you." "I don't know, maybe." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Pa told us to run before they finished. We didn't look back." Jacob nodded. He'd seen enough of the world to know what that meant. The kind of men who killed a man in front of his children didn't stop there. They followed. They finished what they started. "How many?" Jacob asked. 4, Elijah said. "Maybe 5. I couldn't tell in the dark." Jacob stood, walked to the window, looked out at the road again. The light was stronger now, spilling across the valley in long golden bands. It was the kind of morning that should have been peaceful. "You got a gun?" Elijah asked. Jacob glanced at the rifle above the door. "I do." "You know how to use it?" Jacob's mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close. "I do." Elijah hesitated, then said, "Sir, you don't owe us nothing." Jacob turned, looked at the boy for a long moment. "No," he said finally, "I don't." "Then why?" "Because a long time ago," Jacob said quietly, "someone helped me when they didn't have to, and I've spent every day since trying to be the kind of man who'd do the same." Elijah didn't know what to say. He just sat there, staring at Jacob like he was something out of a story his father used to tell, heroes and gunslingers and men who stood when everyone else ran. Sarah's eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. She just looked at Jacob and whispered, "Thank you." Jacob nodded once, then pulled his coat on. "Stay inside, don't open the door unless I tell you to." "Where are you going?" Elijah asked, standing quickly. "To see how much time we have," Jacob said. He took the rifle down, checked the chamber, slung it over his shoulder. Then he stepped out onto the porch and into the morning light, leaving the two children behind in the warmth of the house. The wind had died down, the land was still. And far in the distance, just barely visible through the haze, Jacob saw it, a thin line of dust rising against the horizon, moving slow and deliberate toward his ranch. They were coming. The dust rose like a warning. Jacob stood at the edge of his property, rifle in hand, watching the line of riders materialize out of the heat shimmer. 4 of them, maybe 5, it was hard to tell with the way the light bent and wavered across the flats. But they were coming steady, no hurry, like men who knew there was nowhere left to run. He'd built a life here, 15 years of sweat and solitude, a small ranch carved out of land that didn't want to be tamed. No neighbors for miles, no one to hear a gunshot, no one to ask questions. That had always been a comfort. Now it felt like a trap. Jacob walked back to the house, slow and deliberate. Elijah was standing at the window, his face pressed to the glass, and when he saw Jacob, he stepped back quick. "They're here," Elijah said. "Not yet," Jacob replied. He leaned the rifle against the wall, checked the revolver on his hip, then looked at the boy. But soon. Sarah was sitting on the cot, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale. She didn't say anything, but her eyes followed Jacob like she was memorizing him. "Elijah," Jacob said, "there's a root cellar out back. Hatch is hidden under the woodpile." Elijah shook his head. "I'm not hiding." "You're not fighting either," Jacob said, his tone flat. "You're 14, you'd be dead before you cleared leather." "I can help." "You can keep your sister safe," Jacob said, cutting him off. "That's how you help." Elijah's jaw worked, his hands clenched into fists, but he didn't argue. He knew Jacob was right. Sarah stood, unsteady, and Elijah moved to her side. "Come on," he whispered. "What about you?" Sarah asked, looking at Jacob. Jacob crouched down so he was eye level with her. "I'll be fine," he said quietly, "but you two need to stay quiet no matter what you hear, understand?" Sarah nodded, her eyes wide and wet. Jacob reached out, rested a hand on her shoulder. "Your brother's a brave kid, so are you. This'll be over soon." She didn't believe him, he could see it in her face, but she didn't argue. Elijah took her hand, led her toward the back door, and Jacob watched them disappear into the yard. Then he turned back to the window. The riders were closer now, close enough that he could make out their shapes, wide-brimmed hats, long coats, rifles slung across saddles. They moved like men who'd done this before, men who knew how to corner prey. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, and waited. They stopped 50 yards out. 5 of them, spread in a loose line, horses stamping and blowing, dust still hanging in the air around them. The man in the center was older, grizzled, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. He sat easy in the saddle, one hand resting on his thigh, the other holding the reins loose. "That's far enough," Jacob called. The man smiled, slow, cold. We're looking for a couple of kids, boy and a girl, you seen them. Jacob didn't answer right away. He stood there, rifle held low but ready, his eyes moving from man to man, measuring, calculating. Don't know what you're talking about, Jacob said finally. The man with the scar tilted his head. That's so. It is. One of the other riders, a younger man with a patchy beard, spat into the dust. We tracked him here, old man, don't lie. Jacob's gaze shifted to him. You calling me a liar? The younger man opened his mouth, but the scarred man held up a hand. Easy, Dalton. He looked back at Jacob, his smile gone. We got no quarrel with you, friend. Just hand over the kids and we'll be on our way. They're not here, Jacob said. Bullshit, Dalton said, leaning forward in his saddle. We saw the tracks. They came right up to your door. Jacob's grip tightened on the rifle. Even if they did, they're gone now. The scarred man studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. You're a poor liar, and a fool if you think you can protect them. I'm not trying to protect anyone, Jacob said evenly. I'm just telling you to get off my land. Another rider, a thin man with dead eyes, laughed. Or what? Jacob didn't answer. He just stood there, unmoving, his face carved from stone. The scarred man sighed, like this was all very tiresome. We killed their pa 3 days ago, caught him squatting on land that didn't belong to him, gave him a chance to leave. He didn't take it. He shrugged. Now we're finishing what we started. That's murder, Jacob said quietly. That's justice, Th. Scarred man replied, and those kids are witnesses, can't have that. Jacob's jaw tightened. You'll have to go through me first. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. That's your choice. It is. For a moment no one moved. The wind picked up, rattling the fence posts, carrying the smell of dust and sweat and horses. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, sharp and mocking. Then Dalton went for his gun. Jacob was faster. The rifle cracked, sharp and clean, and Dalton jerked backward in his saddle, a red bloom spreading across his chest. He slumped, fell, hit the ground with a dull thud. The other men scattered, shouting, reaching for their weapons. Jacob dove behind the water trough as bullets tore through the air, splintering the porch railing, punching holes in the wall behind him. He came up firing, levering another round, and one of the riders screamed and toppled from his horse. 3 left. Jacob rolled, came up behind the corner of the house, and the scarred man's bullet took a chunk out of the wood where his head had been a second before. You're dead, old man, the scarred man shouted. Jacob didn't answer. He was already moving, low and fast, circling around the side of the house. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady. This was who he used to be. And for the first time in 15 years, he didn't feel the weight of it. He felt the clarity. The silence after the gunfire was deafening. Jacob crouched behind the barn, his breath coming hard, rifle hot in his hands. He counted to 10, listening. Hoofbeats, 2 horses, maybe 3, retreating fast toward the ridge. He waited until the sound faded into nothing, then rose slowly, scanning the yard. 2 bodies lay in the dust. Dalton, sprawled on his back, eyes open and empty. The other man, a stranger Jacob hadn't even gotten a good look at, face down near the fence line. The scarred man and the others were gone. For now. Jacob checked both bodies, confirmed they were dead, then dragged them out past the tree line where the buzzards would find them. He didn't bury them. Men like that didn't deserve the courtesy. When he got back to the house, the sun was high and merciless, baking the blood into the dirt. He found Elijah and Sarah in the root cellar, huddled together in the dark. Sarah was shaking, and Elijah had his arms around her, his face pale but his jaw set. It's over, Jacob said quietly from the hatch above. Elijah looked up, eyes wide. They're gone. Some of them. How many? 2 dead, 3 ran. Jacob reached down, offered his hand. Come on, let's get you inside. Elijah helped Sarah up, and Jacob pulled them both out into the daylight. Sarah's legs gave out halfway to the house, and Jacob scooped her up without a word, carried her back to the cot by the hearth. She didn't say anything. She just stared at him with those wide, dark eyes, and Jacob wondered what she'd heard, what she'd imagined while the bullets flew. "You're safe," he said softly, pulling a blanket over her. "For how long?" Elijah asked from the doorway, his voice hollow. Jacob didn't answer. He poured water into a basin, washed the blood and gunpowder from his hands, then sat down at the table and let the exhaustion crash over him. Elijah sat across from him, silent for a long time. Then, "You killed 2 men." "I did," Jacob said. "You ever done that before?" Jacob looked at him. "Yes." Elijah swallowed. "Does it get easier?" "No," Jacob said quietly, "it doesn't." They sat in the silence for a while, the weight of it settling around them like dust. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, a soft whisper that felt like the world trying to forget what had just happened. "Why'd you do it?" Elijah asked finally. "You could have given us up. You'd be fine right now." Jacob leaned back, stared at the ceiling. "You ever hear the story about the Good Samaritan?" Elijah shook his head. "Man gets beaten, left for dead on the side of the road," Jacob said. "2 people pass by, don't stop, don't help. Then a stranger comes along. Stranger's got no reason to care, but he stops anyway, binds the man's wounds, carries him to safety." Elijah frowned. "What's the point?" "Point is," Jacob said, "the stranger didn't help because it was easy. He helped because it was right." Elijah looked down at his hands. "Our pa used to say something like that." "He sounded like a good man." "He was," Elijah's voice cracked. "They killed him for nothing, just nothing." Jacob reached across the table, rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He died protecting you, that's not nothing." Elijah's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. He just sat there, trembling, and Jacob let him. After a while, Sarah's voice came from the cot, small and fragile. "Mr. Mercer." Jacob turned. "Yeah." "Are they coming back?" Jacob hesitated. "Then, probably." "What are we gonna do?" Jacob stood, walked to the window, looked out at the Thailand. The sun was sinking now, painting the sky in shades of copper and ash. Somewhere out there, the scarred man was regrouping, planning, coming back with more men, more guns, more anger. "We are gonna be ready," Jacob said. That night they ate together. Jacob made a stew from the last of the salt pork and potatoes, and they sat around the small table like a family that had been broken and glued back together wrong. Nobody talked much. Sarah picked at her food, still too weak to eat properly, and Elijah watched Jacob like he was trying to figure out what kind of man he really was. After dinner, Jacob pulled a blanket from the chest in the corner and laid it on the floor near the hearth. "You 2 sleep here tonight, I'll keep watch." "You need to rest too," Elijah said. Jacob shook his head. "I've gone longer without." Elijah wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just helped Sarah settle onto the blanket, then lay down beside her. Within minutes, exhaustion pulled them both under. Jacob sat in the chair by the window, rifle across his lap, and watched the darkness creep across the valley. He thought about the scarred man, about the way he'd smiled when he talked about killing their father, about the way men like that moved through the world, taking what they wanted, leaving wreckage behind. Jacob had been that kind of man once. Not like the scarred man, he'd never killed for sport or cruelty, but he'd killed more than he could count, more than he could forget. That's why he'd come out here, to the middle of nowhere, to build something quiet, something that didn't need a gun to protect it. And now here he was, blood on his hands again, standing between 2 scared kids and the kind of violence he'd spent 15 years trying to leave behind. He looked over at Elijah and Sarah, curled together on the floor, and something inside him settled. This was different. This was right. And if the scarred man came back, Jacob would be ready. Not because he wanted to kill, but because some things were worth dying for. They came at dawn. Jacob saw them from the ridge, 8 riders this time, moving slow and deliberate across the flats. The scarred man was in the lead, and even from a distance, Jacob could see the way he sat in the saddle, confident, certain. He thought he'd already won. Jacob climbed down from the ridge, walked back to the house. Elijah was awake, standing at the window, and when he saw Jacob, he opened his mouth to speak. "I know," Jacob said before he could. "Get Sarah to the cellar. Stay there no matter what." "Let me fight," Elijah said, his voice raw. "Please." Jacob stopped, looked at him. "You want to help?" "Yes, sir." "Then live," Jacob said quietly. "That's how you beat men like this. You survive them, you grow up. You become the kind of man who doesn't let this happen to someone else." Elijah's throat worked, his eyes shining. "But—" "Go," Jacob said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elijah hesitated, then nodded. He went to wake Sarah, and Jacob stepped out onto the porch. The riders were closer now, close enough that he could see their faces. The scarred man, 3 he didn't recognize, and 1, a kid, maybe 17, who looked like he didn't want to be there at all. Jacob stood at the edge of the porch, rifle in one hand, revolver on his hip, and waited. The scarred man reined in 20 yards out. "You should have run, old man." "Could say the same to you," Jacob replied. The scarred man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You killed 2 of my men. They drew first." "Don't matter," the scarred man leaned forward in his saddle. "Now I'm gonna kill you, and then I'm gonna burn this place to the ground, and those kids, they'll watch." Jacob's jaw tightened. "You'll try." The scarred man's smile faded. "Last chance, where are they?" "Gone," Jacob said. "Let it go." "Can't do that." "Then you'll die here," Jacob said flatly. For a moment, the scarred man just stared at him. Then he nodded to his men. "Kill him." They went for their guns. Jacob was already moving. He shot the first man before his pistol cleared leather. The second took a bullet to the shoulder and screamed, falling sideways off his horse. Jacob dove behind the water trough as the others opened fire, bullets tearing through the air, splintering wood, kicking up dust. He came up firing, dropping another rider, then rolled left as the scarred man's bullet punched through the trough and water gushed out in a cold spray. 3 left. Jacob scrambled to the corner of the house, reloading as he ran. A bullet grazed his shoulder, hot and sharp, but he didn't slow. He came around the side and fired twice. One shot hit, the other missed, and then he was out. He dropped the rifle, drew the revolver, and stepped into the open. The scarred man was waiting. They faced each other across the yard, 20 feet apart, the morning sun climbing higher, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked dust. "You're good," the scarred man said, "Breathing hard, I'll give you that." Jacob didn't answer. His revolver was steady, aimed center mass. "But you're outnumbered," the scarred man continued. He glanced at the young rider beside him, the kid with the scared eyes. "Shoot him." The kid hesitated. "Shoot him," the scarred man barked. The kid's hand shook as he raised his pistol. Jacob didn't move. He just looked at the kid, calm and steady. "You don't have to do this." "Shut up," the scarred man snapped. "He's gonna get you killed," Jacob said to the kid. "Just like he got the others killed. You really want to die for him." The kid's gun wavered. "Shoot him or I'll shoot you," the scarred man said, his voice cold. The kid looked at Jacob, then at the scarred man. Then he lowered his gun, turned his horse, and rode away. The scarred man stared after him, fury twisting his face. "Coward." Jacob fired. The bullet took the scarred man in the chest, punching him backward out of the saddle. He hit the ground hard, gasping, blood spreading dark across his shirt. Jacob walked over, stood above him, revolver still raised. The scarred man laughed, wet, choking. "You think this changes anything?" "It changes everything," Jacob said quietly. The scarred man's eyes glazed over, and the laughter stopped. Jacob holstered his gun, turned, and walked back to the house. Elijah and Sarah emerged from the cellar an hour later, when the sun was high and the bodies had been dragged away. They stood in the yard, staring at Jacob, who sat on the porch steps with a bandage wrapped around his shoulder. "Is it over?" Sarah whispered. Jacob nodded. "It's over." Elijah looked around at the empty land, the blood already drying in the dust, the stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. "What do we do now?" he asked. Jacob stood, winced at the pull in his shoulder, then looked at the two of them. "You stay if you want." Elijah blinked. "Stay." "Land's big enough for 3, Jacob said, "and I could use the help." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You mean it?" "I do," Jacob said simply. Elijah looked at his sister, then back at Jacob. "We don't got nowhere else to go." "Then stay," Jacob said. "Make this home." And for the first time in days, Sarah smiled. Years later, when the valley had grown green with crops, and the ranch had become something more than just a lonely outpost, travelers would sometimes stop and ask about the old man and the 2 kids who lived there. They'd hear stories about a rancher who'd stood alone against killers, about a boy and a girl who'd survived the kind of loss that should have broken them, about a family built not from blood, but from something stronger. And if you listened close, in the quiet hours before dawn, you could still hear the wind moving through the cottonwoods, a soft whisper that carried the memory of a promise kept. A promise that some men, when the world demands it, will stand and refuse to fall.